Jetzt ist es da, ja. Dieses Mahnmal steht in Nammering. Und das Mahnmal steht im Wald, aber nicht weit vom Bahnhof Nammering entfernt. Der Bahnhof Nammering hat 1945 dieses Gesicht. Es gab 3 Abstellgleise für den Steinbruchbauer, der nebenan arbeitet. Auf diesen Gleisen standen damals 3 Lokomotiven und zusammen 54 Waggons. Was geschah auf dem Bahnhof in Nammering? Der Todeszug aus Buchenwald mit anfangs 5080 Menschen war hier 5 Tage lang auf dem Bahnhof in Nammering. Hier wurden 794 Häftlinge ermordet. Die Nazis hatten die ungefähr 800 Leichen in einem nahegelegenen Sumpf begraben lassen. Als die Amerikaner kamen, vergingen 3 Wochen, bis sie dieses Massenlager entdeckt haben. Sie befahlen dann, alle Männer mussten diese schon verwesenden Leichen ausgraben. Ebenso befahlen sie, die ganze Bevölkerung, Frauen und auch Kinder, mussten durch die Reihen dieser Toten gehen. Sie sollten sehen, was durch die Nazis bei uns geschehen ist. In 5 Dörfern mussten auch Frauen große Gräber ausheben für die Bestattungen. Jeder Tote bekam einen eigenen Sarg. Hier sind wir in Eging. Da war ein Massengrab und hier wurden 171 Tote begraben. Und diese Särge liegen auch heute noch in diesem Friedhof. 40 Jahre vergingen, ohne dass eine Hinweistafel oder ein Denkschrift gemacht worden ist. 1984 hat das Friedensforum in Eigenregie und Eigenleistung dieses Mahnmal aufgestellt. 10 Jahre später, 1995, begingen wir das 50-Jahres-Gedenken und Wladimir Ubarow aus Moskau, ein Überlebender und Teilnehmer von diesem Zug, kam zu uns. Er sprach bei der Veranstaltung. In der Mitte sehen Sie Hans Hübel. Der starb 2010 und er war bis dahin der Kopf unserer Arbeitsgemeinschaft. Eine besonders beeindruckende Szene war, als Wladimir Ubarow eine Handvoll Heimaterde, die er aus Moskau mitgebracht hatte, am Denkmal ausstreute, zum Andenken an seine toten Kameraden. 2001 kamen 7 überlebende Franzosen unter der Leitung von Bertrand. Er hatte in Frankreich 27 Überlebende um sich geschart und sie haben sich monatlich getroffen und von diesem Zug erzählt. Sie kamen und machten eine Pilgerreise nach Aicha, um bei Pfarrer Bergmann Danke zu sagen, denn der hatte für die Häftlinge Lebensmittel gesammelt. 2005, das 60 Jahre Gedenken. Dr. Jerzy Feier kam und sprach zu uns. Er stammt aus Polen, war aber in Deutschland Arzt geworden. 2015 zum 70-jährigen Gedenken hatten wir ungefähr 400 Zuhörer und genauso wie damals wollten wir es letztes Jahr 2020 machen zum 75-jährigen Gedenken. Ich habe im Internet gesucht und einen Leser gefunden, der als Überlebender heute noch in den USA wohnt, in Las Vegas. Er war eingeladen. Und seine Tochter Gail Lesser-Gerber wollte auch mitkommen zu uns nach Nammering, aber es wurde nichts. Wir alle freuen uns deswegen heute, dass wir mit diesen beiden sprechen können. Pfarrer Graf von Fürstenstein hielt an dem Tag, 26. April letztes Jahr, eine kleine Andacht und wegen Corona durften nur 5 Personen teilnehmen. Bettina Blöm und unser zweiter Bürgermeister, Cornolla, der erste Bürgermeister war nämlich krank, legten diesen Kranz am Mahnmal nieder. Und dabei waren auch Gail und Ben Lesser, aber nur analog, kann man sagen, als Bild. Heute ist es für uns eine große Ehre, dass Ben zu uns online sprechen wird. Wir sehen hier eine Karte mit allen Konzentrationslagern. Und Krakau in Polen, das war die Heimat von Ben Lesser. 1939 vertrieben alle Nazis die Juden aus der Stadt oder sie sperrten sie in das Ghetto. Damals gingen die Lessers nach Niederbayern. Sie wurden gewarnt und mussten über Nacht fliehen, als Bauern verkleidet, nach Bochnia. Von Bochnia mussten sie fliehen in einem Kohlenlastwagen, der ein Versteck hatte, und sie kamen nach Munkacs in Ungarn. Das war die Heimat von Ben Lessers Mama. 1944 im Mai wurde Ben Lesser mit einem Todeszug 3 Tage lang nach Auschwitz gebracht, wie viele andere Juden. Dort erlebte er die Gaskammern und die Krematorien. Es dauerte 2 Wochen, dann wurde er mit einem Lastwagen nach Dachau gebracht. Es folgten 8 Monate Sklavenarbeit in einem Steinbruch. Allmählich kamen die Russen näher, so musste er auf den Todesmarsch von Dachau nach Buchenwald. 480 Kilometer zu Fuß und 7 Wochen lang. Am 7. April begann der Todeszug oder der Kadetttransport. Es war ein Tag später. Ben Lesser war nur einen Tag im Buchenwald gewesen. Dann musste er schon in diesen Zug einsteigen und kam nach Nammering. Von Nammering fuhren 2 Züge über Passau und München nach Dachau. Hier sehen wir diesen Todeszug in Dachau. 2310 Tote und 816 Überlebende insgesamt. Denn im ersten Zug, wo Ben Lesser dabei war, gab es nur 18 Überlebende. Das war also ein kurzer Überblick über den Weg Ben Lessers durch den Holocaust. Nun bitte ich Ben, uns seine Geschichte zu erzählen.
So, vielen, vielen Dank, lieber Nick.
Bitte schön, ja.
Vielleicht sage ich das noch zwischendrin. Natürlich kann sich auch jederzeit an den Nikolaus Saller wenden, was jetzt wirklich das Thema Nammering anbelangt. Da ist er Experte. Also für mich ist da unser Saller Nico Experte, hat viel Arbeit und viel Wissen. Gut, dann now we can come to you, Ben. It's really a big honor for us when you can be with us here and with your wonderful daughter, Gail. who made this possible for us. And Ben, how old were you when the war broke out? And can you tell us about the first experience with the Nazi brutality?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Professor Seller, and thank you, Bettina, for arranging this. It's very important. And yes, my friends, I come to you from an era in history where civilization lost its humanity, its heart. A time where there were only three kinds of people in the world. There were the killers and the dead people and bystanders. There were only, the whole world was standing by silent. No one seemed to have cared enough to say a word about what happened. I feel obligated. I am a survivor, and I feel obligated on telling the story so many people, as many as possible, can hear me, because this is very important. There are so few of us left, and what I have to say is very important. Yes, I was born in Krakow, and when the war broke out in 1939, I was 10 3/4, not quite 11 years old. And my whole world changed. We lived in a building on Starowiczna Street, which was a main thoroughfare in Krakow. It was a 3-story apartment house, and we lived on the ground floor. And the third window here was my bedroom. And I remember early in the morning, in 1939, I think it was September of 39, the whole building started to shake. And I ran to the window to see what happened. So I saw tanks were rolling down, and following the tanks, there were half-tracks, and every few steps, a soldier would jump out from the half-tracks and with his rifle, and this is how they occupied the city of Krakow. There was no fighting. And following them, there were the Wehrmacht with the shiny black boots and their goose steps. It was quite impressionable for an 11-year-old in those days. But we didn't know what to expect, but we found out very soon, very fast. On the 5th day of occupation of Krakow, a truck pulled up to the gate of our apartment house early in the morning at 5 a.m. and they started to bang at the door. The super came running down. What's happening? And this was a group of soldiers that came in, and all they wanted to know was where the Jewish people lived. And the super was quick to oblige. He told them that the lessers lived on one side of the building, and there was another Jewish family on the other side on the ground floor. They came running in, having sacks in their hands, open sacks, and they were pistol whipping us. We were still in bed, screaming to throw in all our valuables, money, jewelry, silverware, anything they could find of value, they threw it in. And they were beating up my father to open up the safe. And while my father is trying to open the safe, we hear this terrible screaming from the other Jewish apartment. There was a young couple that lived there, and they had 2 daughters, and the mother gave birth to an infant little boy about 2 months earlier. And when we heard that terrible screaming, my sister Lola and I ran out through the back door to the kitchen door. We ran into their apartment, to their kitchen door, and this is what we saw. We saw this monster was holding the infant baby by its legs and swinging it, and yelling to the parents, make him shut up. While the poor child was woken up with all the commotion, and the mother and the sisters was screaming, our baby, don't hurt our baby. And this monster, you can see he had a smirk on his face. He was enjoying what he was doing. He smashes the baby's head into the doorpost, killing it instantly. We couldn't believe what we saw. Everybody in the room jumped on this monster. And of course, all the other soldiers from our apartment came running in, and they pistol whipped all of us. And they were saying to him, Hans, come on, let's go. And they put in all their valuables into the sacks, and they threw it in the truck, and they took off. That was only the 5th day after occupation of Krakow. I see a picture of my father and my mother, my little brother, my sister Goldie. My sister Goldie lived in Munkac with my mother's side of the family, our grandparents, and my older brother Moishi. And none of these people survived the war. Everyone in this picture was slaughtered by the Nazis. The only survivor of my family was my sister Lola and I. So out of a family of 7, only 2 of us survived. But in Krakow, the ordinances started to come in fast and furious, and ordinances that we have to wear Star of David, a band, new IDs. Our IDs had to have a big J for Jude, and regulations. We had a curfew from 7 to 7, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Jewish people could not be outside of their houses or apartments. And these ordinances kept coming. And it was, there was only one punishment for the Jewish people. There were no juries, no jails, no lawyers, nobody. If a Jewish person broke the law in any way, any of the ordinances, there was only one punishment for the Jewish person. They were shot. And every morning you saw so many people on the streets being killed. It was unbelievable. A new ordinance came into Krakow where the Jewish people are no longer allowed to reside in Krakow, but they gave us a choice. And this was the only time in history that the Nazis gave us a choice. The choice was either you stay in Krakow and you go into a ghetto, so they formed the ghetto in Krakow, or you can leave Krakow and live in a small community, but you cannot live in a big city. So my sister Lola had a young man who was in love with her. He pursued her, and he came to my father. He says, Mr. Lesser, you know how I feel about Lola. Someday I'd love to marry her, but do me a favor, I'll take care of everything. Please come to the same community called Nyapolomice, where my family is going. Well, my father gave him a choice to go into the ghetto or to a small community. Obviously, he agreed. And this young man's name was Michael. And Michael was helping us load everything. And he arranged a wagon with a horse and buggy, a driver, and we put on the wagon everything that we could carry. We were not allowed to take any furniture, but anything we can carry, we were allowed to take. So this is when we found out that my father, by the way, I didn't tell you that my father's business was wine and syrup. He had a wine and syrup factory. He also had a chocolate factory. He was the first one who manufactured chocolate-covered wafers, something like Kit Kat, or only in those days, they made it in little animals like rabbits, bears, and with tinfoil. Every time my father comes home, us kids will search his pockets to see if we can find a little bit of chocolate or something. He always made sure he had something. But anyway, both of his businesses were confiscated. He went to the wine and syrup factory, and there were guards stationed, and they just chased him away. Then he went to the chocolate factory, the same thing. They were guard stations. They chased him away. They wouldn't even let him go in, take his briefcase. They send him, and you can imagine my father coming home when they confiscated his business. It wasn't the same man. I mean, and now my future brother-in-law, Michael and Lola, and everybody is helping to load this wagon, horse and buggy. But this is when we found out that my father had 1,000 American dollars that he saved up for a rainy day. So he took these American dollars and he pasted them in a religious book, in a Jewish religious book. Every Jewish house had a lot of Jewish literature, and they put it in a sack full of books, and they put it on the wagon. And now we're leaving Krakow. As we're leaving Krakow outside of the city, we're being stopped by the Nazis. Halt! And two husky Nazis jump on the wagon, and all they wanted to know, do we have any Jewish literature, books? And they saw 2 sacks full of books, so they picked it up and heaved it on the side of the road. They had a lot of books there. They knew that everyone who didn't go to the ghetto had to cross this road. So they were waiting, and they were going to have a bonfire with all these books. My sister Lola spoke a beautiful German, and she walks up to this Nazi and she says, look, my father rather, is a writer. He wrote his autobiography. Let him keep this one book. And I guess he liked the way my sister spoke to him in beautiful German. He says, okay, we'll give you 5 minutes if you can find it. So you can picture this. The whole family is climbing on a mountain of books, trying to find this one book. All the books look alike. They were either brown or black, leather bound. And when you're climbing on books, you keep sliding down. And he enjoyed watching that games that we were playing, trying to find a book. And after 5 minutes, he chased us away. And now my father is going into a new community with a family of 6. Remember, my oldest sister is in Munkacs, Hungary. A family of 6. My future brother-in-law, Michael, arranged for us an apartment in this house. By the way, those pictures that you see, they're all, they made from memory by my sister Lola. She was a great artist, and she painted all these pictures in 1950. So it was like 5 days after the war, out of memory. And this is the apartment that we lived in. Is one half of this building. The other half was the farmer. He was a orchard farmer. And my father and we all came to this house. You couldn't recognize my father. He was worrying, how is he going to feed the family? And you couldn't get a job. Jewish people were not allowed to be hired. So now it turned out that between those 2 apartments, there was a baking oven. And my father, my future brother-in-law brought my father a sack full of flour, about 100 pounds of flour. When my father saw the flour, his face lit up. He was so happy. Well, my future brother-in-law believed that my father is going to bake bread to feed the family. But my father, instead of baking bread, he started to bake pretzels. Why pretzels? All you need for pretzels is flour, water, and salt. And those ingredients he had. Then he took those pretzels to the neighboring bars, taverns, and he offered it for sale. And of course, it was a novelty in that town, and they started to buy the pretzels. So my father could now afford to bake a bread for the family to eat. And little by little, my father became a baker in that town. He started to bake cookies, mandel bread, all kind of delicacies, cakes, rolled cakes, and he became a little baker in that community. And meanwhile, my sister Lola and Michael get married. And this, by the way, was a marriage in the yard. These were the people, the guests who came to the wedding. Not everyone is in the picture. There were some more people there, but approximately 30 of us were there. And out of all these people, only 3 of us survived. My sister Lola, her husband Michael, and I. This was me at the age of 12. This is my mother, by the way, my mother and my little brother Tuli. None of these people survived. Everyone was slaughtered by the Nazis, including my father, who is not there, and my mother is here. My older brother also married, and he moved out of the house. By the way, this was not allowed. We were not allowed to gather more than 5 Jewish people, but we took a chance. If the Nazis would have found out, they would have probably killed us right on the spot. But these were dear friends of my sister and my future brother-in-law. Anyway, they married and they moved out of the house. So they moved into a duplex. One side of the duplex lived the owner, who happened to be a mayor of that community. And the other side, Michael and Lola had an apartment. Excuse me. Michael is telling the story now. one day, the owner of that duplex, who happened to be the mayor, comes home and he tells Michael and Lola, save yourselves. I heard the rumors that there's going to be a podlava. A podlava means a raid against the Jewish people, either tonight or tomorrow night. So when Michael heard that, he went out and he hired a wagon with the driver. And in the middle of the night, we snuck out from our houses, from our apartments, and we put everything on there that we can carry, and we left Niepolomice. Now, the only place we could go from Niepolomice was the nearest city, which was called Bochnia. Bochnia had a very bad reputation. They had a ghetto, and going into Bochnia, that meant we had to go inside the ghetto. But Bochnia ghetto had bad reputation. Every once in a while, 2 or 3 dump trucks would come into the ghetto in the middle of the night, and they would go from house to house and pick up the children from their beds and throw them into the trucks. Of course, the parents were screaming for the children were screaming for the parents. And when they filled up 2 or 3 dump trucks, they would then leave the ghetto. And as they were pulling out of the ghetto, the parents were running behind the trucks and screaming for their children. The children are screaming for the parents. But these cultured people had machine guns at the end of each truck. And as they saw these parents run behind these trucks, they opened up fire and killed the parents. Now that happened 2 or 3 times, and that resonated throughout Europe. Every ghetto, every Jewish person knew, stay away from Bochnia ghetto because of these atrocities. But we had no choice. We had to go in there. And we went into the ghetto, and we were with the wagon. The driver had to leave his ID with the guard, and they let him in. And inside, we don't know where we're going to go. Where are we? We have no place to go. So while we're driving in the wagon, Michael sees his friend. His name was Farber, who he went to school with. But the friend was a policeman, a Jewish policeman inside the ghetto. You see, they had policemen, they called them capos, but they were policemen. They didn't have any weapons. The only thing they had was a baton. Their job was to keep order inside the ghetto. And his name, Farber, says to Michael, says, what are you doing here? So Michael told him the story. And Farber says, don't worry, but I'll find you a place to live. He took Michael, his family, to an apartment, and he took my mother and father, myself, my little brother to another apartment. Now, just to give you an idea what ghetto living was like, this apartment had 8 other people, and now we were 12. With 4 of us plus 8 other people, we were 12. It was one big room, but it had a little oven, it had a table, it had boxes for chairs, some other pieces of furniture, but there was one piece of furniture that was a very, very beautiful piece of furniture, that armoire where you hang your jackets and your coats, looked out of place because it was pretty instead of all the other junky furniture, but I didn't pay attention to it. Now, inside the ghetto, you had to work. If you didn't work, you didn't get any rations. My job was working in a uniform factory, and I was sewing on buttons on jackets. And anyway, this was my job. But it didn't last long. One day we heard that there is a rumor going to happen, something is going to happen in Bochnia. This friendly couple, Farber, went to Michael and told him something is going to happen tonight or tomorrow night. And when Michael heard that, and this Farber tells him, go save yourselves, hide someplace. Now, ever since those trucks were coming in the middle of the night, pulling out the children from their beds, every house and every apartment had a hiding place. They called them bunkers. That's when I found out that our bunker where we lived was this beautiful piece of furniture. You open the door, you push the closing apart, the back panel would slide apart, and there was a hole in the wall, and 12 people could crawl through that hole inside onto the other side of the wall, and the last person would close the door from inside, put the clothing back in place, close the back panel, and we stood between two buildings. Now, we were lucky that the outside of the buildings were connected, but the roof, the ceiling, the roof was open, and it was snowing. It was winter time. The snow was coming down. We were freezing cold, and we were standing between those two buildings all night, and we heard shootings, dogs barking. We heard screaming, our neighbors being torn apart by dogs, yelling all night long. And then in the morning, it got quiet. When it got quiet, one of our men living there got out to see what happened. And he came out, he came back, he says, okay, the coast is clear, you can come out. And we all came out. When we went outside our room, we couldn't believe what our eyes saw. We saw dead people laying, torn apart by dogs, mothers holding their infants, pieces of people laying all over the place. And there were push carts, men with push carts going around and picking up the bodies and pieces of bodies, piling it into the push cart, and then taking it to the ghetto square, Bochnia Ghetto Square. They piled these bodies and pieces of bodies as high as they could. And then these cultured people came with gasoline cans. They threw gasoline over the bodies, and they started a human bonfire inside the Bochnia Ghetto Square. These are images and memories that I cannot forget. They're in my mind constantly. But we knew that our sister had another hiding place with Michael and his family. So his hiding place was in a doghouse. You heard me, in a doghouse. You open the floor from the doghouse. They had a step ladder going down into the doghouse, and inside they had provisions for 7 people, bedding for 7 people. And my sister Lola is telling me now the story, what happened as they were about to walk into the doghouse. as they were about to walk into the doghouse, another Jewish capo, Jewish policeman, walks up to them. His name was Morris Schiller, and he says, and with him was his mother and his sister. He says, Michael, Lola, I know about your hiding place in this doghouse. We don't know how he knew about it. But unless you take my mother and my sister along with you, I'm going to call the authorities. Well, when they heard that, there was only room for 7. Now there were 9. So Michael and Lola volunteered to stay out, and they walked away. The mother started yelling, no, you are newlyweds. You have your whole life ahead of you. Let me stay out. But they wouldn't hear of it. They just walked away. And the rest of them all went down. There were 7 of them into the doghouse. My sister Lola is now telling the story. As they were walking the streets, Farber sees them and he says, Lola, Michael, what are you doing? Why aren't you hiding someplace? So he says, tells him the story. Michael tells Farber the story, what happened. Farber says, don't worry, where my sister and her 2 children are hiding, there's room for you. Follow me. And they took him to a leather factory, a tannery. Above the tannery, they had a water tank. He says, my sister and her 2 children are inside the water tank. Go up the step ladder. Inside, there is a rope. You can lower yourself. And towards the morning, when everything is clear and the Nazis would have left, I'll give you a knock on the tank. When you hear the certain knock, know it's the whole coast is clear, you can come out. Well, Lola's lowering herself, Michael lowering himself. They see his sister is standing knee deep in water. And the little girl, this daughter, is standing waist high in water. And the mother is holding an infant little boy who was asleep. I guess they gave him something to sleep. And the 3 of them are shaking and shivering. It's so cold. Lola lowers herself and she picked up the infant from the mother, and Michael picked up the little girl from the water, and they were standing in the water all night long. There were little water rats swimming in the water and nibbling at their feet, and they kept kicking all night long. And they heard the same things that we heard: shootings, dogs barking, screaming, yelling. Towards the morning, it got quiet. When it got quiet, they heard that knock on the tank that Farber did, and they figured the coast is clear. They pulled themselves up and they helped each other, and they came out again. When they came out, they put the little circulation back into their legs. And the first thing Lola and Michael wanted to go see is what happened to Michael's family. So they went to the doghouse, and this is what they saw. They saw the whole family laying with a bullet hole in the middle of their head. Even the dog was killed. His little sister, Marika, was holding to a doll. Lola made her a doll for her 7th birthday. She's still holding on to it. When Lola saw it, she started to scream. But Michael is telling her, Lola, you have to be quiet. They may still hear you. Maybe there's still burning bodies there. They may hear you. But he knew what he had to do. According to the Jewish religion, you're supposed to bury your loved ones within 24 or 48 hours, the latest. So Michael, being a religious man, he went out and somehow he found a wheelbarrow. They put their family on the wheelbarrow. Little Marika is still holding onto the doll, and Lola and Michael are pushing the wheelbarrow in the snow and sleet. On top of the mountain, they had a Jewish cemetery. So they pushed him to the cemetery. In the cemetery, Michael found one shovel, and Lola, with her bare hands, frozen ground, they were finally able to excavate a grave for the family. They put the family in, and all of a sudden, Maurice Schiller walks up to them. And he says, it wasn't my fault. And it wasn't his fault because his own mother and his own sister were also killed. But he says, the graves that you just dug for your family, you're going to have to take the family out because I want it for my mother and my sister. Well, when Lola heard that, she started to scream and cry. But Michael says, Lolo, he has the power over us. And they had to take the family out of the grave, put them on the wheelbarrow again, and they found another spot near a fence someplace, and they buried the family. But while this is going on, they hear a Jeep is coming down the hill, going up the hill to the cemetery, and they stop at the cemetery gate, and out jumped two assessmen, and they came into the gate yelling, Maurice Schiller, Maurice Schiller. And he says, Jawohl, here I am. And he walks up to them. As he walks up to them, they pull out their revolver and they shot him. This is what they did to people who have seen too much. And obviously he saw a lot of things happening there that night before. So anyway, how we finally got out of the ghetto, I'm going to have to skip this because it takes a long time and it's a story in itself. I'm asking you to read my book. In my book, you'll find out exactly what happened. But we were able, my whole family and Michael and Lola were able to get out of the ghetto. It was a miracle, but we went out of the ghetto. And while outside the ghetto, we rented an apartment, and Michael found a truck driver who was hauling coal, and he begged him, he says, how about if we'll pay you a lot of money if you can convert your coal truck where the coal is on top, and between the coal and the chassis, there is room for people to hide. And you can take us to the Czech border, Polish-Czech border. And the other side of we have a smuggler who's going to smuggle us through. And he listened to them, and he changed the truck to a double-decker like that, coal on top. And between the coal and the chassis, 10 people could hide. Now, there were some rich people inside the ghetto who agreed to pay because you read in the book how our family made out false papers to them, showing that they're Hungarian citizens so they can get out of the ghetto. And because of this, they were willing to pay for our family to hide and to pay the truck driver and pay the smuggler for our way. And meanwhile, my oldest brother is arrested. Morris is arrested for forging papers. It's all the stories in my truck. he's arrested. Only my father, myself, my mother, my little brother, and I, and Lola and Michael are left. Now, Lola and Michael were going with the first truckload. This was the truck, coal on top and between the coal and the chassis. And they were able to cross. And when the driver came back a few days later and he had the right password, that meant that everything went okay. They were delivered to the border. So that's when we decided to go. 8 people plus I and my little brother went inside this truck. And we were inside the truck. They closed it up and the truck left. Outside Bochnia, maybe about 2 hours outside of Bochnia, we're being stopped. Halt! And when we take a look to the cracks, we saw soldiers with rifles. And they were talking to the driver. And even though I spoke German, I didn't understand because the roar of the engine was so loud, I couldn't hear him. So we were sure somebody turned us in and they're gonna kill us all. But no, the truck started to move. And the truck moved, we felt better. But when we looked through the cracks, we saw that on one step of the truck stood a soldier with a rifle. On the other side of the truck, by the driver's side, was another soldier with a rifle. Now we heard on top of the coal, there were people moving, and the coal dust was trying to filter through. My little brother was about to sneeze, so I held his nose and mouth, stop him from sneezing. And we're just going, we keep going from 1 hour, 2 hours, and the truck stops. And we are praying our prayers. All of a sudden we hear, Dankeschön, Dankeschön, Dankeschön. They were only hitchhiking. Imagine they were on top of the coal, they were on the side of the trucks. They didn't know that under the coal, there are 10 people hiding. We were so lucky, and we were delivered that evening, that night, to on top of a mountain, and the truck stops, empties the coals. He tells us all to go out, and he told us to go 300 meters into the forest, up the hill. There is a tool shed. Inside the tool shed, there is the forest ranger, and he is the smuggler. He'll smuggle you across the border. Well, we walked up there, and sure enough, he was waiting for us, and he took us about 2 or 3 kilometers to walk to his house. And in his house, his wife made a meal for us. We were able to clean up. Remember, we were all full of dust, coal dust, black. We were able to wash up. And by 3 a.m., we had to be in the forest near the border, quietly laying on our stomach and looking up to the guards. The soldiers were walking back and forth with their dogs, back and forth. And we had to wait till 3 a.m. At 3 a.m., the guards go down the hill and they meet fresh guards who will then go up the hill. But while they meet each other, there's a little, they have a little gathering or a little something they say to each other. And then it takes a few minutes till the other guards come up, maybe about 5 or 6 minutes. During that period time, we have a chance to cross the border. And when we watched the guards go down, when they were out of sight, we all shimmied up to the barbed wire, and the smuggler lifted up the barbed wire, and we shimmied across. But he told us that on the other side of the barbed wire, there's a big ravine, and you're going to tumble down unless you sit down and just slide down quietly, hold each other. And this is what we did. It was so pitch black you couldn't see your hand in front of you. We sat down on the other side of the barbed wire, and I'm holding onto my brother, and we started to slide. And we slid a little weight, and then there was a plateau, and we were stopped on the plateau. I asked my brother, "Are you okay?" He says, "Yes, I'm okay." When all of a sudden somebody taps me on my shoulder, I almost jump out of my skin. And he says, "Beinisch?" Beinisch, not only my parents called me like that. Everybody called me Benek. Beinisch says, "I'm your uncle, your mother's brother. How did you know where I was? Where to find me in the black night?" So he says, when Lola and Michael went across 2 days earlier, they told me exactly the spot where you're going to come down. So he waited for us there. And anyway, he took us to an apartment, which was his brother, my other uncle, was waiting there. And we were able to take a bed. We cleaned up, and they gave us new clothes. And the next morning, we had to cross the border into Hungary. Now, to cross the border into Hungary, I don't have enough time to tell you about it, but we did come on the other side of the border, and we were now in Hungary, and we went to a small town. There was a train station, and we waited for the train. When the train came in, it took us to Budapest. Once we were in Budapest, we met with Lola, my sister, and Lola and her husband, Michael, and they had a meal for us, and we were very happy. We had to go to the police station to be legalized in Hungary because we were minors. They had to take us to jail, my uncle, and my uncle had to sign papers that he is going to vouch for us. He's going to be our guardian. And since we are underage, they let us out, and he became our guardian. He took us to the train station, and we went to Munkács. It was about 6-hour train route, a long way. And we arrived to Munkács, and my whole family, my mother's side of the family, they're all waiting there. My uncles, my aunts, my sister, my grandparents, they were so happy to see us. Now, Lola and Michael remained in Budapest, but I went with my uncle, my little brother, and we're now in Munkács. I tell my family the story. They believed me, but they said this will never happen in Hungary because Hungary is an ally of Germany. Why would Germany siphon off soldiers from the front to occupy a friendly country? It didn't make sense. But some people believed me, and my uncle, where he asked me to stay in his house, was a very wealthy man. He had a store where he was selling yardage goods for dresses and for suits. And his house was above the store, and we lived there. And I told my uncle, you know, everything that you have here, all these assets will be confiscated if the Nazis ever come into Hungary. he believed me. And one day he comes home with boxes full of shoes. And he had a pair of shoes for every member of the family. And he told us that in the heels of these shoes, there are diamonds. Know it only in the case of a life-threatening situation, know that you have diamonds, you may be able to save your life. So he gave a pair of shoes to everybody. And life in Munkheit was going on like nothing ever happened before. People were going to schools and weddings and bar mitzvahs, and there were outdoor cafes, and people were eating and laughing and joking, and it was beautiful until in March of 1944, the Nazis just marched right into Hungary. They came into Hungary like their invited guests. They knew every Jewish person, their names, their addresses, their businesses, their schooling, education. They knew everything. How? They didn't have computers in those days like they do today, but IBM had punch cards, and they would sell those punch cards for anyone who would pay the price. Now, IBM does not deny it, but they tell us they didn't know for what purpose they're going to use these punch cards. So within 3 weeks after occupation, they were already shipping people to Auschwitz in death trains, shipping people to Auschwitz to get to all different death camps. This was going on so fast. They told us that we are all going to Germany. Germany needs workers. Able-bodied men and women will be working, and children will be schooled, older people will be cared for. Bring along all your valuables that you can carry, and anything else that you can't carry, leave behind. Anyone found hiding will be shot immediately. And they took us to these cattle cars, and they counted us 80 to a cattle car, and they made us go in. While before we are going into the cattle cars, 2 men are coming with a stretcher, and they had a woman on the stretcher. They set down the stretcher before my feet, and I see my sister Lola. My sister Goldie. I didn't recognize her. Her face was black and blue. I says, Goldie, what happened to you? So she says, she tried to escape, and she went as far as the railroad station, and a Hungarian gendarme who went to school with her recognized her, and he turned her in to the SS, and they beat her to a pulp. Now she was all black and bloody. Helped her get into the cattle car. Now, to describe cattle cars, 80 people to a cattle car maybe wouldn't be so bad if everyone didn't have a bundle or a valise. It got so tight that if somebody wanted to sit down, someone else had to stand up. But what we went through in those 3 days, imagine there was only 2 buckets of water. Once the water was gone, there were no sanitary facilities, no toilets. So they used the 2 buckets. And 1 day, 2 days, the buckets were filled up, and now it was overflowing. And there was human waste all over the floor. We were now happy we had buckets. We can sit in bundles. We can sit on the bundles instead of the floor there in the human waste. day three, we finally, at nighttime, we arrived to Auschwitz, and from there the train goes to Birkenau. Birkenau was where all the killing was done. And this was what everybody knows as Auschwitz. And to tell you the story in Auschwitz will take a long, long time. All I know is we went through hell in there, and we went 2 weeks in Auschwitz, actually reliving hell and what our eyes have seen. And we, even after seeing what we've seen, human beings, children being thrown into fiery pits close to our barrack. And I can't even describe what we saw in how people were being gassed. Unbelievable. But you're going to have to find out what I went through in Auschwitz from my book, because I don't have the time to tell you. But after 2 weeks, they put us in trucks and they took us to a labor camp called Dernau, D-O with umlaut, Dernau. Dernau was a labor camp. And the labor camp was only a rock quarry. So our job was going into the rock, going into the quarry, and as they dynamited the mountain and the boulders were coming down, it was our job with sledgehammers to break them into manageable pieces, throw it into mining carts, run it down the hill, and down the hill they were ground it up in a machine to make gravel out of it, then push it back up. It was very hard labor. And I figured my uncle is never going to survive this. So remember, I had diamonds in my shoes. So I went to the kitchen chef and I bribed them with the diamonds from my shoes and to give my uncle a job in the kitchen, because I knew he couldn't survive there working in that mining camp. So, which he did. He gave him a job in the kitchen, and he worked in the kitchen, which made it a little easier for us because he can eat in the kitchen. He was not allowed to walk out with any food. They were searched. But his one ration that he got, he was able to share with me and his son because he ate in the kitchen. Every day we came back from working and we had to line up in rows of 5. Even the help from the kitchen had to come out to be counted. So one day we come back and sure enough, my uncle comes out, he stands in front of me and in rows of 5, and they count us and they count and they count. They wouldn't dismiss us. The commandant comes down with his Fräulein and he says to us, I'm going to show the Schweinhund a lesson they'll never forget. What happened? 3 of the inmates escaped. And because of this, he orders his henchmen to pull out every 10th person in the line to receive 25 lashes. And as they're counting and pulling out every 10th person, I can see that my uncle is going to be a 10. So I pushed him behind me and I took his place. I figured he would never survive 25 lashes. And I took his place, and I am in the middle of the yard with all the 10s, number 10s, and they brought down 2 bundles of stakes, hardwood stakes, 1 by 1, maybe 2.5 feet long. And they also brought down a sawhorse. If you know what a sawhorse looks like, there it is, a sawhorse. And this is what they ordered us. They ordered us to tiptoe, bend over the sawhorse, but your stomach cannot touch the 2x4 on the sawhorse. One man would pull your trousers real tight while the other man was doing the hitting. And you had to count out loud. If you miscounted, you start from 1 again. If your heels touch the ground, you start from 1 again. If your stomach touches the 2x4, you start from 1 again. And I was number 4. There were 3 men ahead of me. The first man goes up and they count, and he miscounted again and again. And every time they hit him, you can see on his trousers a line of blood coming right through. They hit you so hard because the commandant was watching, and if the man who was hitting wasn't hitting hard enough, he was hitting him over the head with one of those stakes. So they had to hit hard. The first man fell down. He fell down. The commandant goes over, kicks him with his boots, and they get up. The poor soul couldn't get up. He pulled out the revolver and he shot him. When he shot him, his girlfriend goes over, gives him a hug and a kiss, like he just performed some kind of a heroic act. He killed a man. And then number 2, he couldn't make it either. He fell down. The commandant goes over, kicks him, he couldn't get up, shoots him. Number 3 was a little younger man, and he miscounted again. He didn't, his heel touched the ground, it touches the 2x4 again and again. Then he screams out, "Please have mercy on me. Don't kill me." So the commandant says, "Then stand up and come over here and face me." The poor guy stands up, makes 5 steps, and his knees gave up under him. He fell. When he fell, the commandant goes over and shoots him. So they had 3 bodies, and I am number 4. Ben Lesser is number 4. I was the youngest one, but I remember going up to that sawhorse, and I said to myself, "Ben, this is it. If you don't do it right, you're not going to live for another hour. You got to do it just right the way it is said." And I remember going up, tiptoeing, bending over the 2x4, the sawhorse, not touching the 2x4. One man is pulling my trousers like a drum. The other one is hitting, and I am counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Finally, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. I made it. You can hear a pin drop in the camp because nobody believed that anyone could survive this. When I made it, the man who was pulling my trousers real tight says to me in Yiddish, he says, "Go over and thank the commandant." So I stand up, blood's running down my trousers, and I walk over to the commandant. I salute him and I say, "Danke schön, Herr Kommandant." When he hears that, he puts his hand on my collarbone on my shirt, and he twists me around facing the number 10s who are still to be beaten. He says, "Now I told you it could be done. If you do it like this, Junge, you have nothing to worry about." While this is going on, there is a commotion at the gate. They caught those 3 inmates, and they were all black and blue, bloody. They couldn't recognize any of them. When the commandant saw that, just like a child gets sick of a toy and throws it away, he tells us number 10 to go back to our line. And we all go back to our line, he orders his henchmen to bring down a portable gallows. They put in a portable gallows and they hung each one of them separately, and we had to watch it. So I remember the third man was younger, and as they put the noose around him, he started to say a Jewish prayer. It's called Shema Yisrael. It's 6 words. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It's 6 words. Well, when they heard it, they kicked the stool out from under him, and the poor guy was hung. He couldn't finish his last 2 words, which means God is one. Anyway, afterwards, like nothing ever happened, they told us to go for our rations and go into our barrack, go to sleep or take a shower and go to sleep, whatever you did. For weeks, I could not sleep on my back because of my welts, but it healed up finally. I used to sleep on my stomach only. One night we hear cannon fire. The front was closing in. When we hear cannon fire, next morning we went to report to go to work, and there is a loudspeaker in the camp saying, "No one is going to work today. The camp is being evacuated. Line up in rows of 5 and we march you out." So we line up, my cousin and I, and my uncle was already in the kitchen. We couldn't say goodbye to him. We left without seeing him, and we're now on the death march. They call it the death march because if you could not keep up pace with the soldiers, they simply shot you. And all day long you heard pop, pop, pop. And this was going on for weeks. I lost count, but Professor Nicholas Seller told me it took 7 weeks, that the death march took 7 weeks. Imagine. And we arrived finally in Buchenwald, from Durnau to Buchenwald. And when we arrived to Buchenwald, they counted us and they told us to go inside and we will take a bath, a shower there. They'll give us fresh clothes and they'll feed you, which is true. We went inside, they fed us. We went to take a shower. And inside the bathhouse, someone took a picture of me. I must have been an SS-man, a guard or something. And somehow there's a whole story about this picture, how it was found recently, just after the war. So we'll have to skip this. But the next morning we had to go out and we were counted again. They counted us and they marched us out because they said that Buchenwald is also being evacuated. We went outside the camp, maybe about 200 or 300 yards, and we see cattle carts lined up. And they count us number 82 cattle car, and they tell us to go in. So I pushed my cousin in, and I told him, please find a spot near the wall, because I remember going in a cattle car to Auschwitz, and I was in the middle of people all around me. It was terrible. And he did. He found a place, and I found next to him against the wall was a better place. And after 80 people went in, they closed the gate. An hour later, they opened it up again, and they threw in 80 breads, a bread for every person, for every inmate. But picture those people who were next to the door were grabbing 4 or 5 breads. And I and my cousin, we were against the wall. We had nothing. We don't know where we're going, for how long we're going to be gone. So I knew I had to get the bread. So I started to climb over the sitting inmates. And as I'm climbing over them, I feel somebody stabs me in my throat, right through here. And I feel that there's blood inside my mouth. But I had to get a bread. I couldn't stop. So I kept climbing. And I got to this one man. He had 5 breads. I pull one bread out. He punches me. And I continue climbing back to my cousin. And he says, Ben, what's happening to you? You're bleeding. And I put my finger here and it went right through my tongue. Right through my tongue. Now this, I have one bread now in my back pocket. And every night at midnight, I take a piece and I give my cousin the size of a half an egg, and I take the size of a half an egg. Now this bread lasted about 2 weeks. Imagine, people were dying all around me. I had to do it in the middle of the night because if people knew that I had bread, they would kill me for it. It was awful, screaming, yelling, people are dying, dead people all around me. This is after 2 weeks. We're going already 3 weeks, and we finally arrived at some place called Dachau. And they opened the gates and they said, anyone who can walk out, walk through the gates of Dachau. It was through the tracks. It wasn't this gate. It was another place right over the railroad tracks. And we went into Dachau to the back way. And there we saw, there was very few of the people. Most people in the cattle car were already dead. Maybe 4 or 5 of us from the 80 walked out. I didn't count. But this is the cattle car that I was in. Everybody was dead. And there were about a few of us who walked in. And when we walked into the camp, we saw a mountain full of bodies next to the crematorium. They ran out of coal to burn the bodies. So they were piling them up one on top of the other. And they put me and my cousin at the very next barrack right next to these bodies. They didn't even give us a bunk where to lay down. Just on the floor near the end, we were laying against the wall, the 2 of us, my cousin and I, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. But during that time, the inmates felt sorry for us and they gave us a little water, a little soup, very little. On the 3rd day, we hear Befreiung, liberation, Americans, Befreiung. I tell my cousin, let's go see what's going on. And we help each other. We walk into the middle of the yard and we see the inmates were crawling on their hands or knees and kissing the boots of the GIs. They looked like gods to us. We're free. And we go into the yard holding each other. When 2 GIs walk up, they open up a can of Spam that they found in the German warehouses, and they hand it to us. It smelled so good, and we made a big mistake. We ate some of it. And both of us came down with dysentery. My cousin dies in my arms that night after liberation, in my arm, and I still keep holding him, and I'm talking to him. And other men saw that. They came and they took him away. As they took him away, I followed. I wanted to see where you're taking them. But my feet gave out and I dropped. And as I fell, they picked me up, they took me to the end of the barrack, they laid me down there, and I was laying there for hours when a man walks up to me, beautifully dressed in a suit, and he asked me what language I speak. I said, I speak a little Deutsch and I speak Polish. Polish, he says, well, I'm a Jesuit priest from Poland, and I came here from France with nuns and doctors, and we were opening up a field hospital in the yard of Dachau, and I'm going to take you there. So he picks me up like a bag of bones, which I was. I only weighed about 60 pounds at the age of 16. And he carries me to the infirmary, and he tells me something I'll never forget. He says, Benek, what you Jewish people went through was so terrible, so unfair. All you did is just being born to Jewish parents. That was your crime. And for that, they would kill you. And he takes me in the infirmary. And he told me that. Now, to hear that from a Jesuit priest in 1945 was very unusual. Today, maybe you might hear that, but not then. He took me into the infirmary, and none came out, and they put me on a cot. They put a white sheet on it. They laid me down, and she took my vitals, and I remember I passed out. 2 months or 2.5 months later, I woke up in St. Ottilian. St. Ottilian was a monastery in Bavaria. It is a monastery in Bavaria. And the monks gave up one building to make it into a hospital for the survivors of Dachau. So it became like a hospital. What happened to me after I woke up is a story in itself. And I don't believe that I have enough time. I'll ask Bettina, do I have more time? If not, I'm going to have to stop. And I hope that you will read about it, because it's another story, how I met my sister and what happened to my life afterwards. Very interesting. Bettina?